see. We'd like to continue our roundtable now with Mr. Nestor Rodriguez Lobaina. As I said before, he is the president of the Movement of Young Cubans for Democracy, was sentenced to 6 years in prison fighting for greater freedom in Cuba. He was tortured. He was invited to the second Geneva summit, but the Cuban regime refused to let him out of the country. We complained, he was arrested, and he was expelled from the country and is now living in Spain. We've asked him to speak out his personal situation, the situation in Cuba, and the impact of the Arab Revolution on the democratic movement in Cuba. We are listening to Mr. Nestor Rodriguez Lobaina. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank you, NWatch, for having so kindly invited me to speak here, to speak about the tragedy that the Cuban people are enduring. Moreover, I'd like to thank all of you for having come here to hear me speak. Since Fidel Castro handed over his totalitarian power to his brother Raúl Castro, the human rights situation has plunged in Cuba. The Cuban leaders brushed with death in 2006 due to illness set off alarm bells and a reaction in security and intelligence circles in the military structure from which the regime had built its power base in 1959, more than half a century now. The rise of violence against human rights advocates, pro-democracy activists, and their family members, respectively, not only revealed the Cuban people's vulnerability in relation to the universal human rights proclaimed by the United Nations in 1948, scandalously, but also scandalously flouts the Cuban people's own Magna Carta. The Communist Party, the repressive security and police forces, and as well as other entities controlled by government officials throughout the national territory gave their consent and support to these violations. Over the last few years, the regime has been developing a kind of alternative structure to bolster the repression through the creation of paramilitary groups aimed to repress independent civil society. These are spearheaded by the Rapid Response Brigades, the Association of Combatants of the Cuban Revolution, and the infamous Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. They were all appointed by Fidel Castro. He guaranteed them absolute impunity and gave his blessing to these infringements to the constitutional order, which aimed to protect this totalitarian regime in Cuba. General Raúl Castro, moved by military pragmatism, made mention of this violence in a speech delivered before the National Assembly on August 1st, 2010, endorsing violations to the so-called socialist constitution to defend this authoritarian regime. This was nothing spontaneous. The police and the freshly trained military groups jointly struck out at the homes of regime dissidents in a barbaric attack without and totally disregarding the security of the highly vulnerable persons present who had nothing to do with the conflict. Old people, women, and children were trapped in the midst of a violent clampdown as the police, security, and government officials stood by, allowing the law to be flouted. This ensured total impunity before the law. This law has turned into a law of the jungle, and the perpetrators were given free rein to breach constitutional and legal precepts and cause great material and psychological damage to the victims and their property. The repressive process set in motion, according to the most recent information by Information and Press Center, Hablemos Press, set in motion a process that led to 1,499 arrests in 2010. And these arrests were politically motivated. In 2011, some 3,838 members of the democracy movement were detained, a far higher number than ever recovered by the experienced, independent human rights organizations monitoring such figures for many years, including the Cuban Commission of Human Rights and the National Reconciliation or the Cuban Foundation of Human Rights, and many others. Pro-democracy activists have continued to be jailed, along with the forced deportation of many political prisoners. More than 100 were deported to Spain between 2010 and 2011. They were unable to return as long as the current state of barbarity and oppression continues in this biggest island of the Antilles. During the last year, 3 human rights advocates were assassinated by the political regime. Juan Wilfredo Soto Garcia was beaten to death in a police station in the city of Santa Clara in May 2011. Laura Poyan Toledo was head of the pro-freedom movement, Ladies in White, and she died under very suspicious circumstances in the clutches of the state security mechanism. Wilman Villar Mendoza died in his cell during a hunger strike. He had been deprived of running water and stripped of his clothing, and this provoked pneumonia and kidney failure, which killed him on January 19, 2012. Female human rights advocates are increasingly subjected to sexual assault, showing the increasingly aggressive criminal character of these Cuban masters of police repression. Regrettably, I don't believe that the revolutions in the Middle East have been able to have an impact on my own country's situation. Because of the thick iron curtain that was set up, that is, the regime, when they came to power, set up this iron curtain blocking information and generating strong censorship. And I don't think that any of the democratic reforms carried out in Eastern Europe in the beginning of the mid-'80s until the final collapse of the Stalinist bloc in Russia or the other former colonized countries in the region have any effect on us either. On the contrary, the regime manipulates these events and adapts its editorials and official news sources to foster, quote, people's indignation against liberal capitalism, unquote. The Cuban regime has rather entrenched itself in its use of censorship and blocks the free flow of information. This is one of the cruelest structural and institutional blockades against individual discernment and free examination of social conscience in this country, in Cuba. It is for this reason that we don't see any traces of glasnost or perestroika or a velvet revolution or an orange revolution or a Prague Spring or an Arab Spring. The Cuban people remain trapped and subjected to one of the most refined and heinous policies of state terrorism that has now been revamped under Raúl Castro into a policy of state vandalism. If we are to believe the reports that come to us from the island, in Cuba, there has been no reform other than the domestic reforms that have been carried out to prop up the tyranny. Cuba needs deep changes in every sense. But if we are talking about human rights, the first thing that should be done is to immediately and definitively stop imprisoning people for their opinions, speech, collectively organizing or demonstrating, and free all political prisoners still languishing in the dictatorship's prisons, which are centers for human extermination. The aggressive and inhuman Cuban criminal code should be repealed. A new constituent assembly should be convened. One that is based on the United Nations' own Magna Carta. We should begin to rebuild this country, which is now in ruins, both economically, politically, and morally speaking. The Cuban people have the legitimate right to choose their own path to freedom and prosperity through genuinely democratic, free, pluralistic, and participative elections as a prior step to attaining a viable and participative economic model. But I believe that at the present time, a very grave situation is unfurling in my country when we consider that innocent lives are being lost. And the regime seems to getting away with it. This is what happened in the case of freedom fighter Orlando Zapato Tamayo, whom they let die in a hunger strike, denying him the fair and humane prison conditions he asked for. Or with the scandalous repression against the ladies in white. Or in the strike of journalist Guillermo Farina Hernandez, whom the military junta has threatened in full view of the critical and watchful eyes of the international community. Against this big, grim backdrop, the regime has deported more than 100 political prisoners with the help of the Criollo clergy and their ideological forefathers, the deluded and complicit Spanish left wing as they tried to smooth over tensions and hide their shame. Concerning access to internet, the first invitation I received once I arrived in Spain was to the Global Media Forum in Bonn, Germany, where I briefly summed up some, because I don't know all, of the obstacles and hindrances the regime imposes on Cubans to block access to the cutting-edge technology, enabling society to attain a better understanding of the vast information universe in cyberspace. It's no secret that for the past 50 years in my country, the right to the free flow of information and communication has been abolished, and that this was even a so-called legally enforced ban applied to the island and to the power structures. The most regrettable part is that this policy of disinformation, extortion, and censorship imposed on the peoples of Cuba has wreaked greater and greater havoc on the young people of the island, who have been victims of wholesale indoctrination, behavioral mimicry, and blind servility that stultifies and erodes their human dignity and sweeps them up in an existential and moral crisis that spreads like cancer throughout the Cuban social fabric. The Castro regime offers limited and selective digital information so as to prevent any alternative searches or open exchange with the modern world. In the last few years, a type of critical digital civic movement has been building up in my country, comprised of bloggers, independent journalists, and other stakeholders in civil society who have fought long and hard to pull down the Iron Curtain and gain access to information networks, to denounce what is happening in the land, information that the Cuban regime is shrouding in silence. Many of these public communicators continue to be persecuted, harassed, physically assaulted, and even worse, imprisoned until death. Moreover, the small spaces where these information guerrilleros offer their services and operate are placed under continuous surveillance with small video cameras placed on computer tops to reproduce and copy the access keys of the cyber militants. Other, more hermetically sealed enclaves of these emerging services, like universities, businesses, industry, and ministries, are monitored by the so-called nodes or filters. That is, a kind of digital police that controls what comes in and goes out towards or from cyber militants. Thanks to the solidarity shown by some of the diplomatic corps in Cuba, we have been able to open some internet services and give Cubans, irrespective of their political or other affiliations, access to them. Other opportunities will continue to arise to help us break the censure barrier. During the years I was a freedom fighter working within Cuba, I set up an initiative to South Africanize the situation in Cuba. The entire world came out once against racial apartheid in South Africa, and thus they have even more reason today to condemn the discriminatory system predominating today in Cuba. In addition to the country's prevailing racial prejudice, and note that 90% of the prison population is made up of black or mixed blood prisoners, the police carries out relentless attacks against renowned social movements like the racially black Rastafaris, who do not even contest the regime or get involved in politics. Yet the regime hands down sentences for them ranging between 2 and 4 years of jail, accusing them of being a social danger. There's also tourist apartheid and student apartheid. We should recall that in Cuba, according to Fidel Castro, universities are only open to revolutionaries. This means the regime lackeys, that is, Marxist or Leninists, those are the only ones. There is also legal apartheid, since political dissidents never get to benefit from the legal guarantees that would spare them from arbitrary action by the police. Nor are they judged in courts that are independent from totalitarian power. No, the courts are like Roman arenas, where the hapless souls fall into the clutches or pounced upon. I could continue citing a slew of examples of social discrimination and exclusion undermining the Cuban people's dignity and freedom. For more than 20 years, I've been fighting against this regime of barbarity and oppression. I've had to pay a very high personal price. more than 10 years in the jail of this totalitarian regime. I've been subjected to torture. In jail, I had 2 fractures of bones in my face, carried out by another prisoner working for the head of the jail and the head of counterintelligence services. And I had ill treatment endlessly. And for 8 months, I was put with the common criminals who were contaminated with tuberculosis. I was the victor of many arrests, arbitrary arrests, of beatings, attacks against my home, my children, my daughters, my old and ill parents, jeopardizing their very lives. I was subject to a victim of terror and torture in prison for 20 years while I fought for civic rights and freedom in Cuba. I'd like to conclude by saying that my case is not an isolated one. Many Cubans have lost their lives because they wanted to fight for some freedom and to give some hope to the Cubans. The civilized and democratic world is at a fork in the road, and they must follow one of 2 paths, that of the victims or that of those who are oppressing and annihilating the Cuban people. Sooner or later, the oppressors, like others before them, will become anachronistic relics to be relegated to the Museum of Infamy. The civilized world should demand at the United Nations that the Cuban regime should not be part of the Security Council, or the Council of Human Rights, because this regime violates the universal, condemns the freedoms of the Cuban people. 14 times they were condemned for human rights, and it's immoral and unethical that the Cuban regime should remain as a member that stands as an advocate of human rights throughout the world. I would like to repeat, there are 2 paths before us, side of the oppressors or the side of the victims. Thank you. May God bless you all.